You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 520th episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, with last week's episode, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain started on the morning of June 27th, 1864. We looked at one part of the action, that is the assault by John Logan's 15th Corps, but by noon, the 15th Corps' attacks had come to an end.
While 15th Corps struggled up the slopes of Pigeon Hill in the area of Big Kennesaw to the north, Federals from 16th and 17th Corps were formed up into a strong skirmish line and sent toward the Confederate lines.
William Tecumseh Sherman and Army of the Tennessee commander James McPherson hoped that by applying pressure on the Confederates holding Big Kennesaw, the troops from 16th and 17th Corps would prevent the rebels from shifting men around the battlefield and reinforcing threatened sectors of their lines.
On the far left in this area, Brigadier Generals Mortimer Leggett and Walter Gresham both sent forward a cloud of skirmishers from their 17th Corps divisions to engage the Confederate skirmishers on the northern slope of Big Kennesaw and push them back.
The rebel troops holding this portion of the Confederate lines were from Winfield Featherston's and Edward Wathel's divisions from Loring's Corps. In Featherston's division, Thomas Scott's brigade was on the far right, connecting Loring's rebel infantry with Joseph Wheeler's Confederate cavalry, which was guarding the Army's flank.
Scott's rebels were hit by Federal skirmishers from Mortimer Leggett's division. The Confederate skirmish line here was manned by Louisianans, and once they fell back to the main rebel line, Scott's troops unleashed a ferocious fire into the advancing Yankees.
Jabez Cannon, a private in the 27th Alabama, remembered the moment. Quote, "Shells and solid shot tore limbs from the trees and split the tall pines like bolts of lightning. On they gallantly pressed forward until the line was within a stone's throw of our breastworks. When mortal man could stand it no longer, they halted, unable to advance and loath to retreat."
Leggett's Federals went to ground and were pinned down close to the Confederate lines, much like what occurred to the south on the slopes of Pigeon Hill. Sergeant Ira Blanchard tried to make the best of a bad situation by noting that because of the sun and heat, lying on the shaded slopes of Kennesaw Mountain, quote, "'twas not a bad thing."
But Blanchard admitted any comfort drawn from the shade of the trees was ruined by the, quote, "100 shells tearing around over our prostrate bodies."
After being pinned down for several hours, Sergeant Blanchard and the other Federals here were ordered to pull back, having got close to, but never really threatened, the Confederate lines.
On Leggett's right, Gresham's heavy skirmish line fared no better. Manning the Confederate lines to Gresham's front were the Alabamans of Brigadier General William Quarles's brigade. Seeing the number of skirmishers the Yankees were throwing forward, Quarles was worried that they were too many for his own skirmishers to hold back. However, the rebel skirmishers from the 1st Alabama and led by Major Samuel Knox held firm.
Quarles reported, quote, "The steady, well-directed fire of the men drove the enemy back. The Federal officers, with great gallantry, endeavored to bring their men up to a last and final charge, but succeeded only on the right, where the effort was as feeble as it was abortive."
Quarles praised the 1st Alabama profusely in his report and recommended Major Knox for promotion. On the federal side, Gresham blamed the difficult terrain for the failure of his men to threaten the Confederate lines. Quote, "It was an impossibility to advance up the slope of the mountain with the skirmish line." End quote. Well, as it turned out, blaming the difficult terrain was to be a familiar refrain for many of the federal commanders when explaining their inability to accomplish their mission at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain.
Just to the south of Gresham, Major General Grenville Dodge's 16th Corps sent forward a heavy line of skirmishers as well. On the left, from Brigadier General Thomas Sweeney's division, the 9th and 66th Illinois moved up the slopes of the mountain.
On the right of Dodge's line, from Brigadier General James Veach's division, the 64th Illinois was tapped for the job. Their commander, John Fuller, later wrote that the task was simply too difficult for his troops to accomplish. Quote, "They drove the enemy back into his main works near the crest, but the steep and rocky face of the mountain was an obstacle of itself, more formidable than a line of men, and beyond this they could not go." End quote. Well, and the results were quite similar for the Illinoisans Sweeney sent forward.
As y'all will recall, within the context of Sherman's overall plan for the battle, the reason for sending a heavy line of skirmishers from 16th and 17th Corps forward against Kennesaw Mountain was to apply pressure on the Confederates holding Big Kennesaw, and in that way prevent the rebels from shifting men from there to other parts of the battlefield.
But for the Federal soldiers from McPherson's Army of the Tennessee who were involved in this part of the battle, their efforts were much more than simply a diversion. It was a life-and-death struggle. McPherson reported less than 1,000 total casualties, which was comparatively low when considering the appalling bloodshed of the Overland Campaign in Virginia that same summer. But that was small consolation for McPherson's soldiers, who spent hours on June 27th pinned down by heavy Confederate fire on the slopes of Pigeon Hill and Kennesaw Mountain.
The words of Captain James Skelton of the 27th Ohio, who was wounded that day, provide a fitting description of the fighting for many of the Federals who found themselves charging up impossibly difficult terrain against well-fortified Confederate lines. Quote, "This was the day of the famous charge on Kennesaw and the slaughter of the Union Army. I have often wondered why that charge was made, and will now remark that if Sherman made a mistake during the campaign, I would call that mistake Kennesaw."
George Henry Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, was 47 years old in June 1864. As a Southerner in an army of Northerners, Thomas was seemingly out of place, leading the Army of the Cumberland in the Atlanta campaign.
A West Point graduate and native Virginian, George Thomas's loyalty to the Union came at a high personal cost, since much of his family would never speak to him again after 1861.
Thomas's loyalty and competent combat leadership led to professional advancement as he rose from lieutenant colonel to major general in 1 year's time. Thomas gained experience leading troops in combat at such places as Mill Springs, Corinth, Stones River, and most notably, Chickamauga, where he earned his famous nickname. His reputation only improved once he took command of the Army of the Cumberland, the force that charged forward to victory on Missionary Ridge on November 25, 1863, breaking the Confederates' stranglehold on Chattanooga in spectacular fashion.
Despite this impressive record, George Thomas rubbed William Tecumseh Sherman the wrong way. In many ways, they were a study in contrast. In fact, as we've said, Sherman, who was ever a bundle of restless energy, complained to Grant about the deliberate and careful Thomas.
At Kennesaw, after receiving Sherman's Special Orders 28, Thomas was skeptical about the plan. According to a post-war account, upon receiving the orders, Thomas stated simply, "This is too bad." The same account notes that Thomas declined to protest the orders because he believed it would do no good, since he had raised concerns about Sherman's orders in the past and offered alternative strategies, but to little avail. And so here, it seems George Thomas simply resigned himself to carrying out Sherman's orders, even though he thought attacking the Confederates at Kennesaw Mountain was unwise.
When Major General David Stanley, a division commander in 4th Corps, discussed Sherman's orders with George Thomas, Thomas was more diplomatic. When Stanley shared his own strong opposition to the plan and his belief the attack would fail, Thomas voiced agreement, but then told Stanley that nonetheless, quote, "we must do our best," end quote, and said that even though the assault looked daunting, quote, "if we do possibly succeed, it will lead to a great victory."
George Thomas obviously went about the task of carrying out the Army of the Cumberland's part of Sherman's overall plan with conflicting emotions, but his sense of duty ensured he did his best to ensure success regardless of his doubts. Thus it was that Thomas, a native Virginian commanding more than 50,000 Union soldiers, spent June 25th and 26th making preparations to carry out Sherman's boldest assault of the Atlanta campaign, an attack that Thomas didn't believe would succeed, but that he was duty-bound to try to execute successfully nonetheless.
Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Fullerton, the Assistant Adjutant General of 4th Corps, was up quite early on Monday, June 27th, with other officers to prepare for the Army of the Cumberland's attack that day. That morning, in his diary, Fullerton recorded his impressions of the terrain over which the men of 4th Corps were to advance.
Quote, "The country is so thickly wooded and the topography is such that it is almost impossible to tell anything about the enemy's works. The works cannot be seen before we can get right upon them. We are about to make an assault upon works we know little about."
As details of the impending assault spread through the ranks, the trepidation felt by Fullerton was shared by others. As specified in Sherman's orders, to ensure secrecy, the plans for the attack were shared only on a need-to-know basis in the days preceding the 27th, but that morning, word of what was expected of them was finally shared with the troops.
In the ranks of the 125th Ohio, part of Brigadier General Charles Harker's brigade, the men were awakened at 3 a.m. The entire regiment was to strengthen the Union skirmish line and so would be at the forefront of the attacking force. As they joined the other skirmishers, Captain Charles Clark referenced the Old Testament when he wrote years later that he felt the 125th's role that day was to be, quote-unquote, Job's comforters, since the nature of the battlefield was such that, quote, no troops could cross the interval between the lines and live.
From 4th Corps, Brigadier General John Newton's division was tapped to make the assault. That morning, when Newton's brigade commanders came to his headquarters to receive their orders for the day, 4th Corps Commander Oliver Otis Howard specifically instructed Brigadier Generals Charles Harker and Nathan Kimball to form their brigades into columns.
Well, as you guys know by this point on the podcast, typically during the Civil War, the regiments of a brigade were deployed in line of battle to make an attack. Column was used to march units from one point to another, and it was highly unusual for troops to advance in column when in close proximity to the enemy, since the close-packed ranks were much more vulnerable to enemy fire, and so the troops could expect to suffer heavy casualties. Also, a narrow-fronted column couldn't direct nearly as much return fire at the enemy when compared to a broad line of battle. It was the difference between every man in a line being able to fire at the enemy, while only the few men at the front of a column could fire their muskets.
And so Harker and Kimball objected to Howard's instructions to attack with their brigades in column. Howard, however, refused to change his orders. So, as Kimball recalled years later, quote, "We obeyed and did the best we could."
Newton's assault would be made by 3 brigades, all commanded by brigadier generals. On the left was Kimball, while George Wagner's brigade was in the center, and Harker was on the right. In front of Newton, Colonel William Gross's brigade from David Stanley's division of 4th Corps was already deployed as skirmishers, just a few hundred yards from the Confederate line. At 8 a.m., 7 batteries of Union artillery began shelling the rebel lines as a prelude to the Federal infantry attack.
Across the way, the Confederates of Patrick Cleburne's division knew the heavy Union artillery fire meant an enemy infantry attack was imminent. Cleburne's position stretched south from the Dallas Road, and on the left, his lines connected with Cheatham's division. As y'all will recall, the high ground held by Cheatham's troops would come to be known as Cheatham Hill.
Cleburne's brigades were positioned along a slight ridge, with Brigadier General Hiram Granberry to the right, Brigadier General Daniel Govan holding the center right, Brigadier General Mark Lowry the center left, and Brigadier General Lucius Polk deployed on the far left. Several rebel artillery batteries added to the strength of Cleburne's position.
That morning, as Cleburne's Confederates endured the heavy enemy bombardment, waiting for the Federal infantry assault to begin, Private William Barnes of the 1st Arkansas noted, quote, "We resolved to take what the Lord and General Cleburne gave us and do our level best."
Okay, so if we get Newton's attack started, that's going to be a whole big deal. And today, like a lot of you, maybe, but with it being Super Bowl Sunday, we have some stuff going on. Not that we have a dog in the hunt with the Patriots or Seahawks, but Super Bowl Sunday is always a good excuse to get together with friends or family and have a party. And so, well, all of that's a long-winded explanation as to why this is a shorter episode, and we'll save Newton's attack until next week.
But we do still want to give a shout out to Tomas R. and Bandy, who are our newest members, and also say thank you to Jan B. for their donation. Then, of course, a big thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.